So I start by reminding you last session. So on the whole, this is the first session of my conclusion, which is about philosophy of culture. And last time I was considering the third attitude towards mathematical object, which was the attitude of seeing it as showing difference without concept. So the first two attitudes were considering the object as child of truth. So truth comes first, and from truth we derive the mathematical object. And then the second attitude was considering the mathematical object as presented, as presented. And last time I was describing the third attitude, which was looking at the mathematical object as showing difference without concept. So it's completely different because in the first two attitudes, there are ways of grounding the mathematical object. And this third attitude, it doesn't bother with how the object is given or grounded in any way. We only focus on a particular property of this mathematical object. And this property is showing difference without concept. So I started with a quotation from Kant, describing difference without concept as something possible in geometry against Leibniz's principle of indiscernibles. Because Kant says geometry, unlike metaphysics, does not deal with things in themselves.
You should discuss a bit when you read a line, I mean exactly right, or everywhere except.
Yeah, I remember hearing him saying that in L'Accent Féréol. But I think he has a lot of things to say. But okay, it's something to remember. Then I argued that we know in mathematics difference without concept, and even if common sense is completely against it, I think as mathematicians we are used to meet difference without concept, and I first argued that. So I also presented the Platonician ideal cone, which I contrasted with the abstractive cone. And I came to the conclusion that constructive objectivity, at least, relies on symbolic repetition, which means that constructive objectivity, by its very definition, shows difference without concepts. Be it constructive objectivity of natural numbers, or be constructive objectivity of syntactic constituents of formal languages, because these are the two sides of constructive objectivity. So in the case of constructive objectivity, objects which are different without conceptual difference, which show difference without conceptual content, they do so as cases of the same idea. But then we have to consider the case of non-constructive objectivity. And also in that context, we are tempted to consider some objects as different without any relevant conceptual difference. We do so when we have objects which are isomorphic replicas. So I took the example of a structured object in set theory. We know that we can transfer this structure to another part of the universe of sets as soon as we have the relevant cardinality. I took also the examples of equivalent objects within a category, or of categories equipped with translation functors. And then so we also have a kind of pragmatic difference without concepts in non-constructive objectivity. then I studied homotopy type theory, which seems to install difference without concept at the foundational level with famous identity types of homotopy type theory. By the way, thanks to Alex, I read the paper, at least in part, which Marco indicated to us, and it's exactly on the same issue. But they want to, they consider the hypothesis that identity types should concern indiscernible objects, and then they try to translate the indiscernibility relation inside homotopy type theory, which is I'm not sure of that gesture. It's interesting anyway. So we also have in homotopy type theory the univalence principle, who seems to say exactly that isomorphic variants are equal. Also, the path induction axiom seems to say that propositional equality, as it is named, as it is called in homotopy type theory, is governed by identity. So then I discussed univalence structures, sets, and categories in HOT, and I explained that I was never sure that that HOT really deals with difference without concept, because it depends on is it possible that two objects, there is an identification of them without them being the same. And it's not completely clear in the theory as I read it. And in a way, HOT seems to be oriented towards univalence, which means that these very objects that we are used to pragmatically equate in usual mathematics, they would be truly equal. But what does that truly mean? I'm never sure of that. Anyway, I'm not completely satisfied by the HOT approach, because as I understand it, we are able to equate different things because they show the same structure. I gave two examples. When we built Z out of the set of natural numbers, then we are using an embedding of n into Z, and we want n to be part of Z, so we identify the former n with the new, with its image through the embedding. But still, at some point, we have a set theoretical construction which tells the difference. It's not, we don't abandon the difference, we don't completely cancel it.
When we want to identify the integer, positive integer with the natural, extension of n. Why we should do as you said?
No, yeah.
More natural that if I wanted to be sure, I don't know why I would like to be sure. If I want to be sure that the integer 3 is the same object as the natural 3, the most natural thing to do is to take Z by extension.
Yeah, I don't know what you have in mind as extension, because we have the general procedure of algebraic extension, but it doesn't work here. We don't have enough such structure for that. So then the usual explanation of how to take n as a part of Z is exactly the one I gave. Yes.
Why?
Go ahead. There is possibly another way of looking at the univalence and the way they treat equality.
I come back.
Okay, sure. I come back.
I forget something. I come back.
I thought that univalence was wrong. Huh? And rather than thinking that isomorphisms say are equalities, is arguing that you can treat isomorphisms as if it were an equality.
Yeah.
So you, in a sense, you give up the idea of equality because in the end you have to deal with something else.
No.
Then I do see the point that still
No,
you have the problem.
I understand what you say, and I think probably the atmosphere of HOT goes in that direction.
Yes.
They want us to not to take equality as seriously and as fundamental as we usually do. They want us to see that isomorphic situations is the most important thing. And so, but there is more to it, because you know that univalence not only says that logically, if we have equality, we have isomorphism. Yes. And reciprocity. It also says that there is a procedure which transforms an identification into an isomorphism and a reciprocity, which is somewhat stronger. But anyway, I think, the two examples I gave, I remind you, that was first this inclusion of N in Z, and the other one was the equivalence of categories between commutative rings and affine schemes. Because we know that it's very important to see this equivalence, because we know that at the categorical level, there is no more information in affine schemes than in commutative rings. But then at the same time, to say that the difference has to be forgotten doesn't mean anything, because the difference is exactly the construction of spec of A out of A. And that's what we admire Grothendieck for. So we cannot, it's important to keep track of it. So that was my conclusion, that I understand that HOT seems to introduce difference without concept at the level of foundations, but I don't understand how it works and what does it exactly say. So now I come to the last part of these lectures, which is about philosophy of culture. And you may remind that in the first session of these lectures of 2024, I said that I would like to present philosophy of culture as the right framework for philosophy of science. What does philosophy of culture mean? So, and I said it, I referred to Eric Schließer because he was saying that nowadays philosophy of science is sometimes looked down by analytic philosophers, because they consider that philosophy of science is more concerned with history, is more concerned with precise theories, and it means with science itself, and not with the mechanic of pure logical reasoning as analytic philosophy in general. So they are tempted to have some contempt for philosophy of science as not as rigorous as central analytic philosophy. So Eric Schließer, he was rather seeing philosophy of science as a part of what he calls synthetic philosophy, which would be a more comprehensive framework, which would replace analytic philosophy. But then, after having read his paper, I understand that he's not so sure about that, because he wants to keep analytic philosophy. I'm going to say some words further about that. Anyway, for me, it's clear that there is a problem with philosophy of science. It's not easy to locate it in a general picture of philosophy. And my contention is that philosophy of culture is the right framework. So what do I consider as philosophy of culture? I see it both as an enterprise inherited from the past. So philosophy of culture exists already. There have been attempts at doing that. And also philosophy of culture is, for me, something that we should reinvent now in accordance with our needs. One of these needs being having a good framework for philosophy of science. So I'm starting with general reflections about culture. I think that we can approach culture at least in two different ways, and I'm going to say some words about it. The first perspective on culture is seeing culture with etymological lenses. And here we are trying to listen to the Latin word colere, because we know that it comes from, culture comes from the Sopin. I don't know if it's correct in English also. It's colo colis colere colui cultum. So that's the cultum.
I control it. Just go to control whether your body is correct.
So first you can look at culture in the perspective of the colere, or you can also see culture as a locus from which we extract infinite paths that we may follow. So these are the two perspectives. First, I consider culture in the light of the colere. So colere has the first meaning of colere is to cultivate earth. It's the agrarian meaning. And it's sure that we cannot neglect this meaning. And thinking about culture, we cannot neglect the relation of culture with agriculture. And in a way, we already meet the plurality issue at the level of agriculture, because we know that we may speak of a variety of cultures that one may try on such and such soil. So we already have the issue of plurality and perhaps even the issue of heterogeneity. So here I'm using the French gaffio, and I know that there must be an equivalent in English language, but I don't know the name. And it gives several meanings for colere. And so what's the problem?
What's the problem?
So where you went to begin?
I don't know. So what happens?
You went back.
How did I?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, that was the place. So you find other meanings in gaffio. For example, colere may mean inhabit or to honor. So one has the impression that colere means to cultivate, but in such a way that we take care. And maybe this meaning inflection of taking care opens the way to inhabit and to honor, the two other meanings that we mentioned. So if I try to take stock, the Latin word denotes human activity as such, creating an atmosphere where involve poiesis, because it's activity. Colere is activity. It counts at the same time as a way of respecting or caring. And also, colere generates its world. Colere generates its contextual field, sedimentation. When we cultivate, we create layers of the earth, which we may call sediments.
By the way, culturum, I'm looking here at the semi-definite. Culturum only appear in the future. Something that will be cultivated.
Yeah, we could move to the German.
Cultum, not culture.
Yeah,
Culturum in the future.
We have Kultur and we have Bildung in German.
No, I see that purely grammatically speaking, culturum, the air enters the cultivation only when you go to the future. Is the future participle, not is the present. Not the present.
Culture is only something which is going to appear in the future.
In Latin, yes.
In
In Latin, culturo is future participle. It will be cultivated. Ce qui sera cultivé.
Okay.
Ce qui sera cultivé.
That would be in Latin.
That's the grammar. Then I don't know.
Okay.
I think the grammar. It's not a very deep observation.
Okay. I cannot integrate that at the moment, but okay, maybe. So anyway, I see that Colere generates a world, the world of sediments. And we got used to that idea because we were taught by Marxism that human practice produces a world. We were taught that by Marxism, but also by phenomenology in a different language. So now, as a matter of fact, we most often use the word culture, not meaning the agrarian basis. We are rather referring to a higher level of our practice. And so I think that for many people, the activity which is concerned by the word culture has to be a symbolic activity. So if culture is everything we produce, maybe in maybe we can still use the word colere because we are seeing this production in the analogy with the agrarian basis, but still it's not with plants or soils, it's with symbols. And then hence, if we see culture in that way, philosophy of culture would be simply a description or a celebration of symbolic life of human beings. So it would start with the descriptive part, where we consider the historical fact of culture. We consider culture as something which is given. Historical human collectivities, they come with a culture. They show a culture. And so our task in philosophy of culture would be to provide a complete and systematic table of the symbolic uses having arisen in human history, or we can restrict this consideration to particular people and its history. So it makes sense because the word colere is a verb. So symbolic life is made of action, or culture gathers a sheaf of cultural practices. So philosophy of culture, if I follow this orientation, it should be included in philosophy of praxis, which is required by Marxism. It pictures human being as producing and modifying all the time itself. There are famous quotations of Marx where he says exactly that the humankind is producing itself along history. But this producing of humankind by itself happens through transformation of humanity's environment. That's exactly Marx's description. So that's the first way of looking at culture. I see culture in the perspective of the colere. And now I said there is another way of looking at culture, which is the normative phase of culture. So we are not interested in any way of acting or in any kind of practice, but only we are interested in these kind of practices where to go through this, the particular practice you are considering, you have to respect some rules, some laws, some local you have to take responsibility with respect to local demands. So one could say that the meaning components of caring or of honoring in Colere paved the way to this. So we can see culture as gathering everything that we honor, which means that culture gathers available infinite paths, callings able to trigger what I would call a large-scale vectorization. We are vectorized each time we are following an ideal pole, Husserl would say. So when we follow an ideal pole and when we are vectorized, there is an infinite path which is defined by pursuing this ideal pole.
Can you say more about what you mean by vectorized? I don't understand.
We are animated by a vector, which
So we have a
which
direction.
brings us to the ideal pole. And so, the most obvious example is given by Husserl in his famous Vienna lecture. He speaks here of a task of truth, which has been accepted by humankind since the Greek, according to him, in his reconstruction. And science is nothing else than the institutionalization of the task of truth. And so there is a calling of truth, and humanity deals with it since a certain historical moment. And so that's an aspect of culture. This calling, this infinite path, this vectorization towards truth is one aspect of culture. So if we see things that way, at least we include science in culture, which is one of the important features I want for my philosophy of culture. I reject a priori any philosophy of culture which would not count science as part of culture. And you know that there are a lot of people in the contemporary context, when they use the word culture, they don't have science in mind. They are describing a lot of other things, even the cooking, what we do when we are cooking, or any kind of art, but they don't include science. Right.
But there is also the reciprocal attitude that is very common. Also rejected his idea of science and culture. To say science and culture is to eliminate and to disregard any technical specificity of science. So mathematics, science is a culture, physics is a culture, because mathematics and physics are reduced to the great ideas and not to the specific reality that is outside the culture. Okay, we have a cultural approach to mathematics, very often means that is a sort of anthropologization. Mathematics is part of a general way of thinking. And this is all what is important. The rest is purely irrelevant aspect. It's a formalica game for mathematicians, but what is important are the big ideas. That is very often. This means to say that mathematics is culture. Not what you say. That is often.
I think this debate you are evoking is related to what I'm speaking about, because there are also people who say, if I see ideas in mathematics working inside mathematics, then mathematics is part of culture.
It's not.
But if I see mathematics as a purely mechanical practice, then it's not part of culture. So it's always more or less the same debate.
Isn't there a problem to think about? Let me think of how I can say this. Mathematics as a culture. The calculus is taught exactly the same way, even with the same symbols, in Iran and in Beijing.
Yeah.
Jakarta and everything. So there's something about mathematical culture that's somehow transcultural.
Well,
And I think that's,
here you are bringing back the vision of culture through the cholera. Because if you're referring to Iranians, then you are referring to a particular area of the cholera.
yes.
But then I mentioned the other approach, which I'm describing at the moment, which is the normative phase of culture.
Mhm.
Culture is every available infinite past, which is given by our culture. But the infinite past of mathematics is also given in Iranian culture.
So in this interpretation, you can understand well, culture is a sort of sedimentation of our perspective toward the truth, our attraction toward the truth.
No,
It's
not only truth, but the second option is to regard culture as all infinite paths which are given available to us.
Toward finite toward what?
So there is the case of
something virtuous.
something, then I don't want to be, I'm going to give some other examples further.
Can I try another parallel? Going back to the original problem Marco was posing. Take something which is obviously part of culture. The painting of Leonardo da Gioconda at Louvre. And then take a copy of it. While the first is certainly part of culture, I would say, the copy is no longer part of culture, it's just an example of mechanizing what an individual produced to contribute to culture, while the other is just as it is a copy. In mathematics, I'm trying to parallel there, some achievements are part of culture and deserve to be part of culture. Some others, simple repetitions of procedures that solve standard problems, are not so really part of culture. Is that too crude?
I think here you are trying to bring back the issue of culture in general to how we assess sediments.
We have tested
sediments. And so then you say that there are some sediments which are singular and other sediments which tolerate repetition.
Also,
it's also true.
Sorry.
No, yes, please go on.
Well, I think we have to be careful about distinguishing high culture from culture, which is what you seem to be alluding to. So the original painting is part of what we consider culture with a capital C, but actually the reproductions are part of, that's how I learned any of it. I was learning about art in Bellflower, California, not in Europe. So it was only through reproductions that I know anything.
Well,
so
there is another.
See what I mean? So culture doesn't have to function just on the terms of the creation of an individual.
It's also true that it was part of another possible answer is that you cannot reject reproductions in a too easy way. But then, if I stay with my vision of culture as all infinite paths are given to us, then La Gioconda is a sediment of the infinite path towards the states of art, and the EGA are a sediment of the infinite path towards a more comprehensive mathematics.
If I take a path toward the future, and the future is that Varese FC will win the Scudetto, that will never happen. So of course, in the future, it will never happen. It's not culture, so the future is not enough. The sedimentation, my passion for the Varese winning the Scudetto It's not a cultural.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely not an infinite path anyway.
Why?
No, no.
It is, well, it will never happen, so
It will never happen.
they have to wait infinitely long. Sorry.
Yeah, you cannot systematically treat that as an infinite path because
So according to you,
this
the only
point
fact.
but no, then there is what I can tell you that there is more in each of these infinite paths than their never-ending character. I agree with that, but I will try to say something more about it.
So I wanted clarification on what Marco said. So Marco, you emphasize this distinction between the technical part of mathematics and then what makes mathematics interesting to humans, which are two different aspects of mathematics. So do you have both aspects in mathematics as culture, or do you separate the technical aspects from the other aspects?
For the moment, I'm not trying to answer this question. I was simply saying that mathematics is a case of our vectorization towards an ideal pole, and which shows an infinite path. And then you can ask, what is technically part of this infinite path? And I was more formulating that it's increasing mathematical comprehension. That would be a definition of the ideal pole. But then you can say differently that it's solving more problems or finding new techniques. I don't know. There are other ways to describe this infinite path as such.
So I know you want to consider math and science in general as part of culture, or aspect of culture, an instance of culture. But there's a real resistance among scientists to think of it that way.
Yeah, I know.
And I think that's an interesting puzzle.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I remember that I have met this resistance since many.
Yeah,
I completely agree with you. But I'm going to say a bit more by asking why a philosophy of culture. And I think it's going to partly cross this issue. The first reason why I wish a good philosophy of culture is that I wish an open rationalism. What do I mean by an open rationalism? I think we need to take seriously the heterogeneity of culture. We have an experience that law, religion, art, knowledge, to name a few, are not the same. Not only people may specialize in one of these boxes, not in the others, but also each of these boxes comes with a specific local legitimacy. What is valuable in the framework of law is not what appears as valuable in the framework of art, to give an example. So I think it means that we need a general philosophical understanding of this heterogeneity. And it's something paradoxical. And we met this difficulty in a discussion with Brennan, I remember, because a general philosophical understanding of heterogeneity should not stand inside one of the boxes. So it should be outside any box, and at the same time it should account for the value and the singularity of each box. So these are very strong constraints, and one could feel that it's even impossible. But I think what I described, a requirement of such a general philosophical understanding of heterogeneity of culture, it's something which is quite close from what was coined as open rationalism before World War II, at least in France. People, they wished a rationalist philosophy but they wished a rationalist philosophy which would consider the heterogeneity of culture, not deny it. And so this philosophy of culture, this rationalism, this open rationalism would add rationalist dimension to every particular thing human beings cook. It means to any particular aspect of human culture, but it would not reject from the onset a lot of regions because they are not theoretical ones. So the danger with rationalist philosophy is that it only considers theoretical human enterprises. So you know that, and then other reason for seeking for a philosophy of culture, I think that even people who don't wish an open rationalism, so they are okay with a restricted rationalism. They are okay that philosophy is going to coincide only with theoretical philosophy. They are happy with this kind of severe and narrow way of conceiving philosophy or rationalism. I think even these people, they meet difficulties pertaining to philosophy of culture while working at special sciences and dealing with the pursuit of truth. What I have in mind here is analytic philosophy, because you know, analytic philosophy fits to the description I just gave. It's ready to consider a lot of things, but it wants to keep the primacy of theory all the time. The primacy of theory. And so here are some history. I remind you that at its beginnings, analytic philosophy followed a radical path, separating it from traditional philosophy. And for some years, analytic philosophy seemed to take philosophy as the same as philosophy of science with the Vienna Circle. But you know that in the last decades, the picture has strongly changed because now analytic philosophy has integrated many new districts, and now it looks as broad an enterprise as traditional philosophy. We now have an analytic moral philosophy. We have an analytic philosophy of aesthetics. So analytic philosophy seems to be as broad as traditional philosophy was. But at the same time, when you look specifically at what moral philosophy does, or analytic moral philosophy does, or if you look specifically at what analytic philosophy of aesthetics does, very often what they do is that they reintroduce the basic issues of theoretic philosophy into other fields. Typically, they reintroduce the issue of realism. If you look at the big part of analytic moral philosophy, which is called meta-ethics, it's exactly bringing back the issue of realism into the field of ethics. Or if you look at a big debate in analytic philosophy of aesthetics is whether the work of art may be equated with a real object in the world. So it's again the issue of realism, because some other people would say that to count as a work of art has always an emotional content, as we would say in phenomenology. I want to insist that even if you are playing this card of a philosophy which keeps the privilege of scientific or theoretical issues, you meet issues of philosophy. I think that a good example is the issue of logicism, which was very important in analytic philosophy, because one could say that the three founders of analytic philosophy, Frege, Russell, and Carnap, all the three, they chose logicism as their position. And I think that the issue of logicism cannot be narrowed back to a technical issue, because in order to justify logicism, it's not enough to ascertain that some logical formalism has the power of hosting the theoretical basis of arithmetic. It's not either enough to convince ourselves that reason is at best conceived as logical. All these reasons are not enough for deciding that logic and mathematics may be equated.
It's not enough, but it's necessary. So in this case, that is essentially a technique. If you have no theorem,
in what I read, that's the big argument which are given. But these arguments are not enough for me, because I think that we have to deal with mathematics and logic as historically given. I think it's obvious that despite their relations and their partial overlapping, which is even more apparent nowadays, to equate mathematics and logic, we would have to equate logic as lived by logicians and mathematics as lived by mathematicians. And to think of mathematics as included in logic, it would be necessary to show that it's correct with the way logicians live logic and the way mathematicians live mathematics. And this is an issue of philosophy of culture. It asks for a demarcation inquiry. And this demarcation inquiry is going to start from what actors regard as characteristic of their discipline. So now I come to some more things about infinite paths of culture. So I said that I'm going to deal with culture not in the objective way, by describing practices, describing the cholerae and its sediments, but I'm going to deal with culture at the normative level. It means that culture is not a set of given habits or ways. It's not the collection of the observable and historical products of the cholerae, but it's the proposition of infinite paths to human life. That's the way I look at culture. So culture is that which invites us to follow such paths. Each time we follow a path which is offered by culture, we make everything we can in order to be up to such and such stakes. So some examples of that. The first example, I already gave it, is the task of truth, which is institutionalized in science. So it's offered by our culture, which means by our society, that any subject may try to become a scholar, which means that that person is supposed to follow corresponding infinite paths. And it means that that person is going to have to respect a set of specific rules specifying what is expected from a scholar. But other examples is that our societies also allow people to embrace religions, which seems to mean working at following a model of personal flourishment given by these religions.
Somebody like Marcel Duchamp.
Yes.
Wasn't an artist.
Yeah. Well,
he just declared himself to be an artist, and now he was an artist.
Yeah, I think there's one thing. There are a lot of discussions about the work of Marcel Duchamp.
Yeah.
But at the same time, one thing which is completely clear is that he was following an infinite path. At least that is true.
Right, but you were suggesting that you were following an infinite path that's sort of determined by that discipline. So to be an artist means you follow a path
Yeah,
within
yeah.
art.
But
Then-
But Duchamp was a guy who absolutely
No,
overtly broke the rules.
now I understand you are referring to the normative content.
Yeah,
So I think that the case of art is very interesting because within art there is a strong party of people saying there are no rules. But I think that you
Dada was precisely, that's what they did. That was precisely what they did.
yes, a lot of contemporary artists they insist on this vision. But then even for them, I think it's possible to describe the injunctions, define the normative content of following the infinite path. I also did that in a specific book about
Yeah,
art.
I do think that.
But I think Duchamp would not be an exception with the injunctions I define.
I think you're right, but I think it's a subtle point.
Yeah.
Had he written novels instead of
Yes, there is a general case of art where art, for many people, is seen as the opposite of any normative content. But then I think it's not true. If you look at what artists do and what they refer to, the requirements, which seems to inspire their lives, you see that there are some injunctions which one can decipher. But then
I think the production of an artifact is part of that path.
yeah, well,
So
yeah, well, then
I've thought about this.
okay. I don't want to enter the discussion
No,
because
okay. I was just thinking about that case.
so you
it's
see,
not clear what you call infinite. When a path is infinite,
no, yes, you
the
cannot.
search of happiness,
No,
hedonism,
no,
the search of pleasure, physical pleasure. Infinite.
no.
It's culture.
I cannot give you a proof that the path is infinite, but I think that we live the path as infinite. It means that we realize that there is no limit to deepening what is required.
Perversion. My sexual perversion is infinite. Not mine. I have no sexual perversion, but that's the point.
It's
I want to
in
think that
some
any possible spatial perversion is fantastic to me. Infinite, for definition. Culture.
Yeah, no, and so it's interesting because perversion has often been has been described, for example, in Freudian circles, as something which is infinite.
It is.
Which as perversion
It is infinite.
has been described as infinite.
Exactly. So it's cultural.
No, but it's not a characterization. I don't say that following an infinite path
The
of
necessary
culture
condition not sufficient.
is equivalent to following an infinite path. I say that culture offers such infinite paths, and I give some examples. And then what I should add is that each time we are following some ideal pole, we follow that path without thinking that there is a point where we are going to be quit. That at some point we will have done enough. When you pursue truth, you are ready to destabilize any state of truth that you reach. That's how physics works, for example, and that's the characteristic. It's in our relation to the path and to the ideal pole. So I gave the example of the pursuit of truth and the example of religions, but then I gave also the example of art. Contrary to Drew's expectation, because I think that it's connected with the attempt at living an artistic life and producing work of arts.
I don't disagree. I just think that Marcel Duchamp is an interesting
Yeah,
case.
there are a lot of books on Marcel Duchamp, which almost all of them, they focus on that issue. And I think that love is another very good example. It's not only a practical concern and a set of behaviors, but it's also the call for achieving a relationship claiming to be up to the requirements of love. I think we can find this normative face of a lot of things we are speaking about and which are part of culture, but not part of culture in the sense of the cholera, part of culture in the sense of vectorizations. So the idea of my approach, as you understood it, is to examine culture not at the level of sediments of the cholera, but at the level of the infinite paths put at our disposal in our shared symbolic space. That's the general orientation, and I'm not going to say more about it because first I would like to tell you a bit more about the history of philosophy of culture. So I'm going to give you some steps of the recent history of philosophy of culture, because as I see it, philosophy of culture is not something very old. And it's very clear for me that I'm going to do that very much too quickly. And I'm going to ignore a lot of important things, I'm sure of that. And I have to insist to begin with that this history of philosophy of culture is mostly a German one. So I start with hermeneutics, because I think a first important moment in philosophy of culture is the hermeneutical. As you possibly know, contemporary hermeneutics begins with Schleiermacher, because he introduced the idea that interpreting a text doesn't mean unveiling the description of the world this text contains. Interpreting a text means understanding this text as overcoming a situation. So this new attitude introduced by hermeneutics in the sense of Schleiermacher immediately claims to hold universally. For Schleiermacher already, seeing text in that way is mandatory with respect to any kind of text or any kind of local human concern. So Schleiermacher, for example, considered that the art of interpreting literature is hermeneutical. The art of interpreting holy scriptures is hermeneutical. The art of interpreting laws, which happens in jurisdiction, for example, is also hermeneutical. And even more basically, Schleiermacher is very explicit on the fact that to interpret each other in our interpersonal discourse is already hermeneutical. You know, if I have a conversation with someone, I try to interpret in a hermeneutical way what the other person says. So after Schleiermacher, we have Dilthey, who, as is very well known, brings the distinction between Naturwissenschaften, where one explains, and Geisteswissenschaften, where one understands. Well, he says a bit more. He says that to explain means to relate without implication to a world, and seeing necessary connections, causality, and Geisteswissenschaften means to relate to a world we are implicated into, and we see relations which are not necessary relations, but which are motivations relations. And he thinks, Dilthey, that through our hermeneutical understanding, using Geisteswissenschaften, we make sense of our shared culture. So culture, in Dilthey's view, gets woven as shared meaning, which we decipher by exhibiting the motivations of any sediment. Hermeneutics then appears as philosophy of culture par excellence, because meaning is the common cement of culture. So here I'm going to say a bit more about what I learned reading Schlisser's paper, because first, he doesn't agree with my vision that philosophy of culture is the requirement of an understanding of the heterogeneity of culture. He replaces heterogeneity of culture by what he calls division of labor. And division of labor for him is not the Marxist notion. He traces it back to Plato. So he thinks that there is a division of labor, which is already seen in Plato. And this division of labor is partly the result of the heterogeneity of people, because persons, they produce various ways of working. But then he's not insisting on that. And for him, the issue is that we need a philosophy which is able to distinguish the true experts from the false experts. So, which is able to differentiate. There is a kind of noise of the society, which is very well exemplified nowadays by social networks. And this noise of society produces a lot of discourses claiming to be expert discourses. And for Schlisser, what we need is to differentiate authentic expert discourses from non-authentic ones. And this way of this discernment requires that our philosophy still uses the theoretical lens. We still need theory as a way to contrasting false expertise with true expertise. So he's not seeing heterogeneity of culture, he's rather seeing division of labor. And then his problem is distinguishing false expertise from true expertise. But also, if you read his examples, it's very clear that he would like a philosophy which is able to accept any kind of expertise. Any kind of expertise. But he doesn't insist on that. And he thinks that keeping on privileging theoretical attitude is enough for understanding any expertise. And I don't feel that way, because I have the feeling that if you keep on privileging the theoretical attitude, then anything which you cannot bring back to the theoretical attitude is going to be neglected or not really accepted, or it's going to be an object of contempt. So, and he's also not agreeing with the idea that meaning is the common cement of culture, which is this Diltheian idea. But at the same time, in his paper, he describes Kitcher's philosophy. And according to Schlisser, Philipp Kitcher agrees that any region of culture is associated with a local meaning. And Philipp Kitcher doesn't exactly think that we should keep the theoretical attitude to assess all kinds of expertise. And for him, what we need is rather what he characterizes as the Cartwright mode, referring to his friend Nancy Cartwright, because he thinks that the work of Nancy Cartwright is exactly illustrative of dealing with an object and respecting this object. because she seems to both take into account the theoretical content of physics, but also the historical content of physics. And that's the right attitude, which would make us able to decipher any local meaning associated to any region of culture, according to Kitcher, as I read it in Schließer. So I had the feeling that I was closer from Kitcher than from Schließer. But then, just an impression based on the reading of one. I would say that hermeneutics is presented since Dilthey as a possible philosophy of culture because it tries to interpret local meaning associated to any region of culture. And I would say that the work of Ricoeur still witnesses that almost 1 century after Dilthey, because Ricoeur, he wrote about history, philosophy, psychoanalysis, ethics, and literature, to name a few. And so I think that embracing the cause of philosophy of culture entails that we have to follow the encyclopedic compulsion. You cannot do philosophy of culture without going in the direction of encyclopedic compulsion, even if nobody can really know everything. We know that, but still we have to try. Then a second figure of a philosophy of culture would be the dialectical figure. So a strong rival of hermeneutics is Hegelianism. So dialectic method and dialectic ontology allow us to grasp our culture. And as you know, the Hegelian view of culture is that culture is a kind of journey. And this journey is undergone by concept, Begriff in German, or spirit, Geist. So culture is what results from the infinite and never resting work of the concept. That's Hegelian description of culture. So what does philosophy of culture? It focuses on cultural contents and it places them within the adventure of concept. And this would be the best philosophy of culture. We have to consider every particular content and we have to locate it inside the great adventure of concept. And this way of working reaches any content and it expands any content as the spirit's production. Everything is a production of the Geist. And also everything witnesses the fundamental dynamic of contradictory becoming, which is exactly what is named dialectic.
But
yes,
I see on the other side, to call the adventure of concepts
yes,
for Hegel is history, the reality.
yeah.
So in this way, you lose the virtuous character of culture. Anything becomes culture, because anything is part of history. Anything is part of reality. There is not something that is this adventure towards an infinity that is cultural, and then no, anything is part of this class. It's completely part of the reality that is history.
In a sense,
there's only one reality.
In a sense, you are right, but Hegel, he claims not to lose this.
You know that I'm Hegelian. No?
Yeah, I know.
But that is a joke, because he always said, it's 40 years that I'm Hegelian, that I do not believe. But he's convinced that I am Hegelian. So.
No, I think Hegel, he wants to keep both. He wants, you're right, his definition of the adventure of concept is supposed to include everything. So the whole of history is included. But then also he sees this history as vectorized towards the absolute.
Yes.
So, and then this.
No, my point is not that it is where nothing is culture. My point is anything is culture.
Well,
So philosophy of culture becomes philosophy of anything.
so I think, well, he's not offering definitions of culture, but
Exactly,
his way of looking of culture is a holistic way. And then one has the feeling that he's able to include everything in what he defines as the adventure of concept. But at the same time, he sees this adventure as oriented towards the absolute. So you see, I think Hegel would say that my distinction about seeing culture at the level of the colliery, seeing culture at the level of infinite paths is not a good one, because his approach unifies both.
I think that the better example for you would be Croce. But in the same way, the Croce is a clear example of distinction, but in the same way, it's a better example because science is eliminated. Exactly because it's not cultural, because there is no truth in science.
Yeah,
truth
but
is one substantial.
for Hegel, again, for Hegel, this whole adventure is oriented towards truth also, in his notion of truth.
Yes, but the truth is absolute. I think that I suggest you to look at Croce's.
But both absolute and truth are two names that he would accept for his ideal pole.
And then I am Crocian, that is sure.
Well, just I wanted to insist that his framework is not my framework, but I want to tell the story of his framework. Okay. Then another step is given by the journal Logos. So philosophy of culture has been an official motive in post-Kantian German philosophy. So here I want to mention the journal Logos, which appeared between 1910 and 1930, and it was officially devoted to philosophy of culture. And here are some names of the contributors to the journal: Windelband, Rickert, Simmel, and Weber. And you see that Windelband and Rickert, they are two neo-Kantians, and Simmel and Weber, there were two people trying to create sociology as a new discipline. So contributing to the Logos journal, you had neo-Kantians and also philosophers embracing human sciences. And what did they discuss? So it was rather short history, only 10, 20 years, in one journal. But I think it was very important also because these four names are big names, and they represent very well two facets of philosophy of culture. A Kantian concern, because Kant is the guy who discovered that there is a legitimacy in theory, there is another legitimacy in ethics, and there is another legitimacy in aesthetics. And he tried to define the three legitimities, and that was a way of dealing with philosophy of culture in my comprehension of it, because he was acknowledging the heterogeneity of culture with his three critiques. So there was this aspect, and the other aspect, which is doing sociology, which means looking scientifically at what people actually do. And in philosophy of culture, you have the two aspects, two facets. And what did people of the journal Logos see as main problems? So they mostly worked at understanding how culture can be both subjective and objective. Because at the objective level, culture boils down to a collection of cultural sediments and a collection of cultural habits. That's more or less what I described as the world of the colliery. But there is also the subjective aspect, which was important for people writing in the journal Logos. It's the notion of culture as a way to name a cultural personal accomplishment. you say that someone is cultivated, that he has reached a certain level of culture. And what you mean is that that person has managed to deal with cultural objective sediments in order to achieve a more satisfying versions of themselves. So here is a joke. That's what people say in rom-coms. They say that because of a good relationship, they reach a better version of themselves. But that's the idea of culture, that you use everything which is given, socially given, as a cultural objective sediments, and you use that in order to achieve a better version of yourself. And so culture has the meaning of a subjective flourishment. But people also, in the journal, they discussed heterogeneity of culture, but most often by denying it and positing an obvious unity. So, for example, I discovered that even Cassirer, he was not seeing really heterogeneity of culture, because all his symbolic forms were ways of walking in the direction of truth. So he was unifying all symbolic forms below the general goal of reaching truth. And in the journal, you also find other contributors who want to understand the cultural process in general as deriving from a want of essence of humankind, what they call a human eccentricity. So some words about Marx, Frankfurt School, and Lyotard. So there is another development which follows to some extent Hegelian path, which is the Marxist development. We know that there is a consideration, a description, an outline of a description of culture in Marx. You have, for example, you find the opposition between superstructure and infrastructure. And there is the determining role which is attributed to economy or to political economy, to use an even more Marxist phrase. And so one has the feeling, taking together the notion of superstructure, the notion of infrastructure, and the directing role attributed to political economy, that Marxist philosophy of culture simply says that economy explains culture. So insistence is put.
Economy is what determines the world.
Yeah.
I don't see what is the purpose of culture. It's what make you live as you live, not you think. Of course, also as you think. But
Yeah,
also it's the same problem.
Superstructure. Superstructure is the Marxist identification of the realm of culture.
Yeah, the structure identifies the superstructure, but not only the superstructure.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I agree with that. It's a holistic.
It's the same problem that Hegel does.
It's a holistic vision of culture again. True. But then also another point which is common with Hegel is that this vision puts insistence on becoming, on becoming. But becoming, if you follow the Marxist view, is supposed to proceed from praxis. And within practice, the concrete layer of economical production prevails. So now it's the moment where I stop, because it's 1:30. So
There is conclusion.
no, conclusion is far.
Conclusion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.